Hi, my name is Sarah Norsworthy, and today we're going to be talking about how educational technology can support anti racist teaching. We're really thinking about how we can use ed tech and really make visible what anti racist teaching looks like. We're going to be focusing on work from students in kindergarten through fifth grade. So, a little bit about me. I currently am teaching in a remote biomedical need school for a district in Maine. We have 14 students this year serving grades 1 through 8, and one other teacher. And so, in many ways, this is an ideal context for innovative education. And as always, I am looking to learn from my students what works and what supports them in feeling seen as whole and honored beings in our learning space. So this year, as in all years, I am a learner in my context, and as I think has been true for so many of us over the last 2 years. Our learning curve is great. One of the pieces that came up for me in March of 2020, when we looked to see which of our students was really thriving in remote education. For me, it was students of the global majority, students who, for various reasons, in the in person classroom context, I was teaching at that point fourth grade in a school that teacher led school. We had no walls in our school. And therefore, with few walls, although it creates a lovely openness and a sense of community, there also is a lack of privacy that comes along with learning. And so, one of the first things that I noticed was the fact that my students of the global majority, particularly those who had brought with them into our classroom space multiple languages, were thriving online and with the privacy that online learning provided in a way that I had not seen in the classroom. And so that really piqued my curiosity. And so for the last 2 years, 2.5 years, I have really been doing a deep dive into exactly what is it and how. What are the moves that we're making in remote education that can then be transferred into the classroom that really are allowing students to be seen? And particularly, this lens of anti racism has come up not only in the current context since the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others truly brought the Black Lives Matter movement to the forefront of our sort of social context in the United States. And as that as that moment in many people's lives seems to have passed, it has not. This is a moment that has been overdue and focus on how our children of the global majority are being served in schools and set up to have joyful experiences in our country, which has had structures and systems that have oppressed and marginalized people of the global majority for over 400 years needs to happen. So when I, as a white English speaking, cisgender, US born woman am in front of, either on a screen or in person, a large number of children of the global majority. The schools I've had the privilege to teach in for the last 10 years have been urban and urban emergent schools in Maine, where a large portion of our students have been immigrants and refugees and increasingly asylum seekers. So I have a responsibility as a white educator to really examine my teaching practices to ensure that I am being anti-racist and that my teaching is lifting all students, with particular attention to how my teaching is allowing children of the global majority to thrive in our learning spaces. So my own family, I will show you, and this theme of my whiteness will come through. You can see on this screen a picture of my two children on the day that my daughter was born. This is Oliver meeting and greeting his small sister Lily. Then you see my mother with Lily and Oliver, just a little bit older, with her dog on a COVID visit where she came to Maine and quarantined, and then was finally able to join us for walks and for Thanksgiving. The center picture on the bottom is of my wedding 3 years ago. My children again, Oliver and Lily, my husband Jeff, and one of his three children assisting Lily and Oliver with reading at our wedding. And the top right corner is a picture of my father on the beach in Rhode Island with me as a 2-year-old. At that point, I was an only. Within a few months, I was an older sister. So you can see consistently that the pictures of my family, there is a lot of whiteness. I was also educated in predominantly white spaces. I attended private schools and some public school. I attended boarding school and a liberal arts college. And then I went to San Francisco for a few years and came back to New Hampshire for graduate school. And after graduate school, have been in Maine. I would say that in most of my day schooling, which for me was really kindergarten through 8th grade, it was rare to have classmates of color. And there were certainly years when there were no educators of color or students of the global majority classmates in my class. And so this is something that I think about and reflect on. And I'm particularly cognizant of the impact that not talking about race and not seeing anti-racism labeled and talked about had on my development as a white person, and therefore on my teaching as a white educator. So I am in a state of reflection, always of inquiry, and of noticings, namings, and wonderings. So, when thinking about anti-racism, thinking about definitions, because words matter, I am drawing from the work of Tima Okun, whose document that outlined the characteristics of white supremacy culture was written over 20 years ago. And recently, this year, a new website was published, whitesupremacyculture.info. And on that site, you can learn more about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And there are a lot of resources. Highly encourage people who are engaging on this journey to spend time on this site. So we're going to be thinking today about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, most particularly one, right way thinking. We're going to be thinking about worship of the written word, and we're going to be thinking about individualism. We're going to be thinking about how when those show up in our classrooms, the way in which racism presents itself, and then how we can work to mitigate unintentional harm that we may cause by having internalized these characteristics of whiteness. Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing the systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. Anti-racism is active. Today's, we're going to focus a narrow lens, particularly on educational practices that sustain anti-racist teaching. And again, how educational technology can help us to maximize that work. So in this article that was published just this year by Jamila Pitts, we have listed characteristics of what anti-racism really looks like for educators. So anti-racism is being discussed in many contexts, and this is work that many school districts, buildings, teaching teams, and individual teachers are taking on. This is an article I would direct you to explore in depth what anti-racism looks like for educators. Today, we're going to be thinking most particularly about the areas of curriculum, teaching and learning practices, and the wellness of teachers, staff, and students. So, educational technology, we're going to define that term. What does educational technology mean? As Star Kelly, curator of education at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine, shared with our fourth grade class several years ago, technology is anything that humans develop to make our lives easier. Educational technology, then, by extension, encompasses tools that humans have created which support education. This broad definition of educational technology moves us away from iPads, Chromebooks, and smartboards, tools used in many 21st century educational spaces, and includes pencils, art mediums, birch bark, and burnt sticks. Educational technology is not new. Today, we will be talking particularly about digital education, educational technology. So, thinking about digital tools created to support education, the expressing and receiving of information. So, Kolb and Kolb identified the 4 stages of learning in 2009 as experiencing, thinking, reflecting, and acting. Digital educational technology supports all 4 of these stages of learning. So, how does leveraging educational technology actively allow us to reduce educational trauma, especially racial trauma, to create educationally just spaces for all learners? So, the formula that I have been working on in collaboration with my students, for none of this work would be possible without the engagement and collaboration of the students I am privileged to learn and be taught with and from. So, we have found that a combination of predictable technology, predictable thinking routines, as well as emotional attunement and global awareness really is what is needed to create liberatory educational spaces as we search for those spaces, again, that Dr. Bettina Love calls us to find where all children may thrive. When we think about liberatory educational spaces, we are thinking about places where there is a from fear, freedom from fear, creating the conditions where it is safe and joyful to learn. The technology that we will be exploring today includes Google Meets, Jamboard, Pear Deck, and Seesaw. I will be highlighting the ways in which we as educators can leverage these tools in the service of honoring the multiple ways our students access, consider, and share their knowledge and ideas. This is only one small part of developing an anti-racist educational practice. It is one which is especially important for those of us teaching wholly or in part in a remote context to adopt. So Google Meets offers us, as of the fall of 21, more than it offered us in March of 2020. Students have choices. They can have their cameras on and off. There are multiple ways for students to engage. They can speak, they can chat, they can react. We can, using Google Meets and multiple windows, allow for the almost instantaneous scaffolds of pictures, historical and current, and videos. All students have the capacity to lead in a Google Meet, whether that's presenting their screen or to have host controls. For students who would like to access them and find it to be an enhancement of their learning, captions are available. I learned very quickly that many of my students' reading was improving by virtue of the fact that in their loud households, they were reading my words rather than listening to me on Meets. Google Meets allows for students to be able to see many of their peers or one. Backgrounds available now allow for individual privacy, and there are polls available for check-ins, temperature, and understanding checks. The combination of these tools allows students to feel safe in their learning, to know that they have the privacy to ask questions, to be seen as it is comfortable for them. That matters. So as we think about Pear Deck is a tool which we use, which allows students to work privately, allows educators to choose to lift work individually or collectively, and I'll be showing how and how this work can be especially directed to be anti-racist, and allows for a variety of ways to show thinking. So thinking about that one way of thinking, one right way, thinking about that worship of the written word particularly. Jamboard allows students to work collectively or side by side. It allows educators to scribe and jump in when students request that support, and allows for a variety of ways, again, for students to show their thinking. So, what are some ways in which racism and anti-racism can show up in educational spaces? We're first going to be looking at curriculum and how educational technology can help. So, racism in curriculum shows up as educational violence through omission, erasure, and dismissal. We have in many of our learning spaces the omission of truthful histories, the erasure of peoples, and the dismissal of the funds of knowledge, the languages and cultures our students bring with them into our learning spaces. Velez and Ibanez and Greenberg in 1992 began to discuss the idea of the dismissal of the funds of knowledge, and these funds of knowledge are capital in our classroom. So, racism shows up through omission, erasure, and dismissal. How does anti-racism show up? How might it show up in our spaces? So, anti-racism is practiced. Anti-racism is active, therefore it is a constant and ongoing practice. And anti-racism is practiced when the funds of knowledge that our students bring into our learning spaces are not merely welcomed, but are elevated, celebrated, honored, and valued. Elevated, celebrated, honored, and valued. So let's look at some examples of the ways in which we can elevate, celebrate, honor, and value the funds of knowledge our students bring into our learning spaces with the use of educational technology. So this piece of work here was around journaling those ideas for small moment stories. Through the use of Jamboard, students are able to use images and to use writing. When we are asking students to write about their feelings, their pets, their foods, their places, we can use those visuals to support them. This is one of the ways it might look. This particular slide is actually one of my slides. I'll be showing you some student work. This was an example that we built together as students asked me questions. And you can see here, I'm modeling the fact that we can use Post-its, we can use the text tool, and we can use images to show our stories. One piece of anti-racist teaching that has really been important in my practice with my students is to focus on honoring multiple ways that students for whom English is not their primary language are still able to thrive, show up, and be honored with their languages and with tools to be able to communicate across multiple languages, especially in remote contexts. How else does racism show up in classrooms? So racism can show up in subtle ways, in the use of pronouns like us and ours. So here's an example of a document that was shared with me. In this document, which was work that came out of a Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, The district that created this document named the goal of sharing books from cultures different from ours. From ours. How might we inspire our colleagues to engage in the inquiry required to mitigate harm? How do we ensure that all teachers learn to appreciate the significance and the harm that this message may cause? What concrete action and steps are in our team building district and state plans? How else might this look? Ideally, teachers should have regular opportunities to discuss students' racial trauma and its effect on learning and classroom behavior, sharing their teaching strategies and resources, and working through their own discomfort to come to a better understanding of their own racial beliefs and practices. This comes from choosing to see the racial stress that afflicts our Black students by Rihanna Elise Anderson, Farzana T. Salim, and James P. Hughley. So educational technology can help us here, as many of our districts, many of our schools have not yet developed the practices that we need to create just classrooms. And so by using technology, we are able to connect with each other via Twitter, via conferences, via professional development like this. And so technology and the connection that comes with technology that removes the need for us to do this work individually, but to do it collectively is available to educators through our conscious use of educational technology and leveraging it for our own professional development, which is our responsibility, but to do as we stand and are on screen in front of children. Racism shows up in assaults against languages. The languages carried into our learning spaces, especially by our students of the global majority. We must write their words, say their words, and honor their words. We must do this for and with our students of the global majority and encourage all students to use the languages of their cultures in their words and in their actions. So how might this look with educational technology? So when possible, offer students access to a text in multiple languages. When a creator has included Spanish, offer the Spanish text first. Allow students to share their thinking in the language they choose. So this is where Seesaw is incredibly helpful. You can see here screenshots of an activity created in Seesaw where the book, Evelyn Del Rey is Moving Away, is linked to the audio, and the audio is available via Epic. And first is Spanish and second is English. A word on digital and audio texts. I have noticed that when online publishers publish texts in multiple languages, oftentimes pronunciation and definitions do not follow. That is not an equitable practice. An anti-racist digital text written in a language other than English would provide the same supports. And I encourage us to reach out to the providers of our curricular materials to ensure that languages are being treated equitably. Another way to think about lifting language and honoring the languages students bring into our learning spaces is by use of Jamboard. And so in Jamboard, this was a morning meeting activity where a student thought of a fruit, and we asked, I think it was 5 questions to see if we could identify the fruit. These were some of the fruits that came up. You'll notice carrots. That is the place for inquiry to happen later in the year. We accept exactly what our students give us and make a plan for instruction. So as we discuss the apple and the peach and the bananas and the lime, our Spanish classmates offered us their language. We got the spelling correct. We practiced our pronunciation, And you can see here that the English is first. We wrote the English first. As soon as the Spanish was introduced, we popped it right up there. And so students were able to teach, to learn, and to use their language to talk about the foods and the fruits that matter to them. So moving on from curriculum to teaching and learning practices and how educational technology can help. So racism shows up in educational spaces when white faces and white voices are omnipresent, and voices of people of the global majority are absent. Anti-racism shows up in educational spaces when we show faces and voices of people of the global majority and name that this matters. So you'll see a little further on some examples of how we do this in our space. I cannot emphasize enough the naming that this matters. When we say to a student, I am going to show you a book written by Jacqueline Woodson, and I want you to notice who the creator of this text is. What do you notice about Jacqueline Woodson? What do you notice about our author who has created this story for us? And students lift their Blackness. We are honoring and naming and identity and naming and highlighting that that is something we are paying attention to because we must. Racism shows up in educational spaces through perfectionist practices, including 1, right way thinking. Anti-racism is practiced in educational spaces when we honor and provide multiple ways of being, thinking, sharing, and receiving knowledge. So, how might this look in a classroom context using Pear Deck? So this is an activity that we actually did. So the work I'm sharing today has all come from this year, from this cohort of 1st through 8th graders. So there is a lot of intersectionality in our classroom. And for the first year, this is the widest identity of ages, of grades and stages that I have ever taught. To have a basically one-room schoolhouse in a virtual context is fascinating, and I feel incredibly fortunate to be learning from my students what is working for them. So one of the things that we have explored is the use of Pear Deck. So before we read Evelyn Del Rey, we dug into the concept of a neighborhood. And of course, having used identity maps and begun to understand a bit of the lived experiences that students have brought into our learning space this year, I learned quickly that several students moved to Maine from New York just as the pandemic, a few months before the pandemic began. And really, when they think of their neighborhood, they are still thinking of the city. So you can see here examples of how students have been able to think about what they notice and what they see. Students are using the drawing tool on Pear Deck to circle and label. You can see our first grader is working on words like people and window. And so right there is the opportunity for formative assessment around what are the sounds that our young scholar knows and can place in text and what we get to work on next. And I'm excited to do that with this young learner. You can see a student who has more experience with text, but is not necessarily older, has a bit more language and is using the text function to name that there are red buildings, people, and cars. As we continue to look at the work from this beginning of the year, building classroom community activity and beginning to look at these books, which are mirrors of our own lives, you can see that this student chose to use both a picture and words as they approximated the word pizza with the question of what might you smell. Then you see another student, I will smell bakeries, bread, and gas from cars. So I have the opportunity to do formative assessment. Students are only seeing their screen unless I choose to lift the work and project it on all of our screens. So there's that privacy, which so many students struggle with for spelling. And as often as I explain that words are tricky, um, that we say things slowly and write down the sounds we hear, and all of those pieces that we'll continue to learn about together this year, the what we ask of students to publicly write really needs to make sure we need to make sure that it's done in a circle of concentric safety. And Pear Deck allows that. So it allows students who might feel vulnerable in our classroom spaces to be able to show their work to an educator and then have that choice to have the work lifted. So another example from this same activity is the how might you feel, right? So what do you notice? What do you see? What might you smell? What might you feel? And here you can see just the difference in feeling and voice that comes through, right? We have one response: happy, calm; hungry, and a funky; and busy and noisy. I will feel like I will never get to sleep, right? So personal expression. Again, the written word is here, but it looks differently. And we welcome the drawn pizza as much as we welcome the all caps, as much as we welcome the text. We welcome what students have to offer into our spaces. So another benefit of tech in terms of seeing what happens is we get these amazing surprises. So this was an activity, again, thinking about building classroom community in an anti-racist way in the beginning of this fascinating year of teaching and learning together. This was a response to basically an activity which was find 5 objects outside, and what did you observe? And we have this story. There is a flower who was lonely who met a rock. The rock was friendly, but they were bored. Then they found a leaf. Leaf was crying. The flower said, hello, why are you crying? The leaf said, because a stick left me, because he said I was not cool. The rock said, he is a meanie. I think you are really cool. Then they saw stick. Leaf was scared. A little grass sprout said, oh no, the bully is coming. Then stick said, move aside, nerds. Rock said, we're not nerds, you're just a bully. Yeah, said flower. Then stick ran away. The end. In a classroom context, in a paper and pencil context, in a looking at your peers context, I'm not sure that this creativity would have come through from an assignment where many students took a photograph and wrote a short paragraph describing their object. And I was able to learn a lot about this young learner from what I saw them do with technology. So racism shows up in educational spaces when we honor the written word above all other forms of expression. And anti-racism is practiced in educational spaces when we honor and attribute value to traditions of oral, visual, rhythmic, and movement-based expression. So here we are going to listen as educational technology allows us to capture a student's storytelling. So listen while the student speaks. Look at my messy screen.
So we went to the beach and we had fun there, but my sister found a baby crab that was already dead. So and then I made something and we collected shells and some rocks. And then I cleaned them. Some of them were already going in the sand.
Okay, so right here we are, and in this scenario, sorry about that. In this scenario, we are noticing that a student has a lot of storytelling capacity, right? And we are also able to capture that. So here's another student.
Hi, I read how to watch the video about how to draw an anime with phase 3 for review. Like this this drawing. I drew some over here. Um, so when I started drawing, I was really detailing with the face first. I didn't get to finish yet. I will finish it soon, and then I can share it. So with this drawing, I mostly drew the head. First, I mostly did a circle. For example, I did this, right? And then I did the head part. It took me a while to get the head. This is just an example. So I did the head like that. Then I started erasing a bit. And then I started drawing the lines. I Most people draw 2 lines, but I drew 3. So then I could get a better head shape, better texture. I put in the eyes. Eyes. It took me a while to get the eyes right. The mouth also took me a while, and the nose. I tried drawing ears, but I don't like drawing ears. Because I mostly make them too big, like a monkey or something. For example, I did this. That looks a bit weird to me. I don't know why. Um, so that's mostly what I have to share. But I would recommend this if you like drawing anime or you're interested. Bye. Ciao.
So, just to give context, that was in response to a lesson on choosing a book in an online digital technology platform, and to sharing what the book was about and what you learned about it in the time you had. So, look at the richness, right, that educational technology was able to allow us to capture and to lift of the students. So we've looked at curriculum and some teaching and learning practices, and now we're going to be moving into wellness and how educational technology can help. So racism shows up when we perpetuate ideas of individualism, right? Reinforcing the myth that individuals could or should be able to succeed independently. Anti-racism is practiced when collaborative thinking is lifted, when we see ourselves as connected, an integral part of a group, and that our collective efforts matter. So here's an example, again using Jamboard, of what it looks like when we, instead of working through a problem on our own, are able to talk and collaborate with each other. We're able to use visual tools to share our thinking. We are able to show emotions using those ever-present emojis. Of course, I blocked off the student whose work I did not have permission to share. And then you can see here that students were able to co-construct that learning, and they're able to save a record of their thinking. So lifting the collective and lifting collaborative work. Racism shows up in educational spaces when we publicly shame and assign guilt and blame to our students. And colleagues, we do that so often. Anti-racism is practiced in educational spaces when we practice inquiry, empathy, and adopt a stance of unconditional, positive regard to our students. Unconditional, positive regard came from Carl Rogers. And as Alex Chevron-Venet shared in Equity-Centered Trauma-Informed Education, this stance of unconditional positive regard says to students, I care about you. You have value. You don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing's going to change my mind. So how do we do that in the classroom using educational technology. So one of the ways in Google Meets, one of the tools is the poll tool. We use this tool in our classroom almost every morning. It allows the meeting host to pose questions, giving the user the privacy to answer. When we then have the poll results, before we get them, we often make predictions about how the class is feeling. We're able to then talk about how we might be mindful and the actions we might take, having a sense of the temperature of our space. And then after the meeting, the host is notified of who voted which way and can have those check-ins or be attuned to how our students are showing up that day without needing to have a public conversation. Breakout rooms are huge. When Google Meets introduced breakout rooms last year, it was probably the most important thing that happened in our year of remote learning. Breakout rooms can be used in individual workspaces, and students have the privacy to ask questions without fear or judgment. They allow for the privacy that all deserve and some require for learning. Another tool using Pear Deck where students can anonymously share their opinions and their thoughts is the overlay tool where students can drag a dot. This was the culmination of the neighborhood activity I shared earlier. In this particular example, students, after exploring both neighborhoods, indicated which neighborhood they most wanted to live in. Then, using the tools in Pear Deck, we asked students if they felt comfortable sharing their thoughts out loud. And students indicated if they felt like they really wanted to, and I always call on those students, whether they feel okay, whether they're nervous or not to. So I can then hover over these bars and know who is ready to participate. And then at the end, always I check in and say, has anyone changed their mind and would they like to? So racism shows up in educational spaces when we teach without connecting our teaching to the identity of our students. So anti-racism is practiced in educational spaces when we center the identities of our students. And as anti-racism is active, this includes talking about race. As Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul tells us in her introductory letter in Stamped for Kids, until we learn to talk about race, the poison of racism will not go away. So when we are thinking about how we talk about race and racism and how educational technology can impact that important conversation in our classroom, that critical conversation, right? Each year, how we start talking about race differs. Talking about race is not an option, however. So when our teaching stems from the noticings and wonderings of our students, the message that we give is you matter. And here you see an example of two identity maps from our class this fall. And we see the question mark on one of white. So there is the beginning of an inquiry in all sorts of directions. And that was our gateway as we then began to think about using books. So books, right? Educational technology, we have author read alouds. This is where you can see here on this slide that we have linked to EPIC. We have linked to author read alouds whenever possible. We have one of my favorite versions of The Word Collector by Peter Reynolds being read by President and Mrs. Obama. We have books in different languages. And so we center books, and books are the way that when we have student questions, we explore books, and our books begin to lead us to the information, right, that we're seeking. So we think about the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop around windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors. Recently, I learned about the work done in 2019 by Uma Krishnaswamy in their article, Why Stop at Windows and Mirrors? Children's Book Prisms. And this idea that books can disrupt and challenge ideas about diversity through multifaceted and intersecting identities, settings, cultural contexts, and histories. So as our year proceeds, we are talking about books as exactly that: windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors, and as prisms to disrupt and challenge your existing ideas. And the idea of racism and race is centered. So, in closing, I encourage you to teach the tools, ask the questions, develop habits of thought, notice, see, and wonder, mine our students' wonderings, affirm their worth. This is the work. Colleagues, we are designers. We create spaces, safe and spacious. Texts are our medium, thought, our collective light. Tech is simply a tool for creating access, and love is our guide. Thank you for your time and attention today, and I look forward to connecting with you further. Please reach out to continue any conversations that this presentation may have sparked in you. And thank you.